Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something, well, maybe a bit surprising. It's about a daily habit many of us have.
That's right, we're asking, can the simple temperature of your food and drinks, how hot they are, actually affect your risk of esophageal cancer?
It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? We always think about what's in the food.
Exactly. We focus on ingredients, maybe additives, things like that. But this is about the physical heat itself. And there's enough research out there that scientists thought, okay, we need to pull this together and take a serious look.
And that's what we're doing today. We're diving into a major study, a big meta-analysis published back in 2015 in BMC Cancer. Chen and colleagues did the work. Our mission here is to unpack what they found, what the data really says, and, figure out what it might mean for you.
And this kind of study, a meta-analysis, it's a really powerful tool for this sort of question. It's not just one group's results.
Right. So maybe let's start there. What exactly is a meta-analysis? Why use that approach here?
Sure. So think of it like a study of studies. Researchers set clear rules, find all the good quality research on a topic,
Okay.
and then they statistically combine the results. It's like creating one giant data set from many smaller ones.
So you get more statistical power, see things you might miss otherwise.
Precisely. You can spot patterns, get a much more precise estimate of, say, how big a risk factor something is, because you're looking at thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people instead of just hundreds.
Got it. So tell us about this specific meta-analysis, the Chen study from 2015. How did they put it together?
Okay, so they did a really thorough search. They looked through all the major scientific databases for studies published before May 2014. They were looking for studies that specifically investigated this link, hot food and drinks, and esophageal cancer risk.
Nice.
And they focused on observational studies, mostly case control and cohort studies. Those are the types you often use to look at risk factors in populations.
And how many studies, how many people did they end up including? Must have been quite a few.
It was substantial, yeah. They included 39 different studies in the end.
Yeah.
And they were careful to make sure they weren't double counting people.
Right.
So the final pooled data represented 42,475 unique individuals. And within that group, importantly, there were 13,811 cases of esophageal cancer.
Wow. Okay. Over 42,000 people, almost 14,000 cancer cases. That's a lot of data.
It really is. It gives you a solid base to look for associations.
So what was the big question they were trying to answer with all that data?
The main goal was pretty clear. Use this combined data to get a reliable answer on whether regularly consuming hot beverages and foods is linked to a higher risk of esophageal cancer.
Right.
And they also wanted to see if other things mattered, like where people lived or the specific type of esophageal cancer.
All right. The moment of truth then. What was the headline finding? Hot stuff and cancer risk, yes or no?
The bottom line was yes. They found a statistically significant link. Regularly consuming hot beverages and foods was associated with an increased risk of esophageal cancer.
Okay. Increased risk. How much increased? Can we put a number on it?
We can. They calculated a pooled odds ratio, or OR. The overall OR was 1.82.
1.82.
And the 95% confidence interval around that was 1.53 to 2.17.
Okay, let's break that down. An odds ratio of 1.82. What does that actually mean for someone?
It means that, based on this combined data, people who typically consume their food and drinks hot were almost twice as likely, 82% more likely to develop esophageal cancer compared to people who consume them warm or cold.
82%. Almost double. That sounds pretty high.
It's definitely a notable increase, and that confidence interval, 1.53 to 2.17, being entirely above 1 tells us it's statistically significant. They're 95% sure the true risk increase is somewhere in that range.
Now, the study also mentioned something called high statistical heterogeneity. I think the value was I1.4 equals 92.8%. What does that mean? Does it weaken the finding?
Good question. High heterogeneity means there was quite a bit of variation in the results between the individual studies they included.
So not every single study found exactly an 82% increase.
Exactly. Some found a stronger link, some weaker. But, and this is key, the fact that the overall pooled result was still clearly significant, despite that variation, actually strengthens the conclusion. It suggests the trend that hot consumption raises risk was consistent enough across many different studies and populations to show up clearly when combined.
Okay, so the overall signal is strong, even if the details varied.
Right, and looking into why it varied is where subgroup analyses come in, which they also did.
Right, you mentioned they looked at different types of esophageal cancer. Did the risk apply equally to all types?
That was a really interesting finding. No, it didn't. The risk was significantly elevated for one specific type, esophageal squamous cell carcinoma, or ESCC.
ESCC. And remind us, are these different types found in different places in the esophagus?
Generally, yes. ESCC is more common globally and usually occurs in the upper or middle part of the esophagus. The other main type, esophageal adenocarcinoma, EAC, is more common in Western countries and tends to arise lower down near the stomach. It's often linked to things like chronic acid reflux.
Okay, so potentially different causes. What were the numbers for ESCC, the squamous cell type?
For ESCC, the pooled odds ratio was 1.60, still a significant increase, about 60% higher risk. The confidence interval was 1.29 to 2.00, so clearly above 1.
A 60% increased risk for ESCC. And what about the other type, EAC, the one lower down?
For EAC, the picture was quite different. The association was not statistically significant. The OR was 0.79, but the confidence interval was wide, from 0.53 all the way up to 1.16.
Ah, so because that range includes 1, you can't say for sure if there's an increased risk or even possibly a slightly decreased risk for EAC based on this data.
Precisely. For EAC, this meta-analysis didn't find a significant link with hot consumption.
That's fascinating. Heat matters for one type, but maybe not the other. You mentioned they have different known risk factors, too.
Yes, the paper points that out. ESCC is strongly linked to things like smoking and heavy alcohol use. EAC, as I said, is more tied to reflux, obesity, Barrett's esophagus.
So the fact that heat seems to primarily affect ESCC risk kind of fits with the idea that they are really distinct diseases.
It does lend support to that view, yes. But why heat would impact ESCC development specifically and not EAC, well, that's still a question that needs more research.
Okay, so besides the type of cancer, you also mentioned geography played a role in those subgroup analyses.
Yes, that was another key finding. The strength of the association varied significantly by region.
Where was the link strongest?
It was particularly strong in the studies from Asian populations. There, the pooled OR was 2.06.
Wow, more than double the risk.
Yeah, 106% increase with a confidence interval of 1.62 to 2.61. Very clear. It was also significant in South American populations. The OR there was 1.52, so about a 52% increased risk.
Okay, significant in Asia and South America. What about Europe? They must have included studies from there, too.
They did, but interestingly, the association was not statistically significant in the European studies they pooled. The OR was 0.95, very close to 1, and the confidence interval went from 0.68 to 1.34.
So no clear link found in the European data in this analysis. Did the researchers speculate why that might be?
They offered a couple of potential reasons. One was maybe just smaller sample sizes in the European studies they had access to, meaning less power to detect a link if it exists.
Makes sense.
But another, maybe more intriguing idea relates to how drinks are consumed. They suggested that, for instance, adding cold milk to tea or coffee, which is common in some parts of Europe.
Right, like in the UK.
Exactly. That could lower the actual temperature reaching the esophagus quite a bit, even if people still perceive the drink as hot, compared to, say, how mate is traditionally drunk very hot in parts of South America, or certain teas in Asia.
Ah, so the actual temperature hitting the tissue might be different even if people use the same word, hot.
It's a plausible explanation for some of the difference, yeah. It highlights the problem with relying on subjective reports of temperature.
Definitely. So, okay, we have this link, especially for ESCC, particularly strong in certain regions. What's the thinking on why? What could be the biological mechanism here? How does heat cause cancer?
The paper discusses several plausible biological pathways. The most straightforward idea is just repeated physical damage, thermal injury.
Like little burns over and over again.
Essentially, yes. Chronic irritation of that delicate lining of the esophagus. And we know chronic irritation can lead to inflammation.
And inflammation is often linked to cancer risk, isn't it?
It is. The paper mentions that chronic inflammation can stimulate the production of nasty stuff like reactive nitrogen species and nitrosamines, which are known carcinogens. They even cite other research finding specific gene mutations, like in TP53, in esophageal cancers from areas where drinking hot beverages is common. That could tie into these inflammatory processes.
Okay, so heat damage, inflammation, potentially cancer-causing substances or mutations. What else?
Another related idea is that the constant thermal damage could weaken the esophagus's protective barrier, the epithelium.
Making it easier for other bad things to get through.
Exactly. If that barrier is compromised, other carcinogens, maybe from tobacco smoke, alcohol, or even certain food components, might have an easier time reaching the vulnerable cells underneath.
So the heat kind of opens the door for other carcinogens.
That's one way to think about it. Also, they suggested that higher temperatures might actually speed up the metabolic processes that activate certain carcinogens. So if carcinogens from smoking are present, the heat could make them even more potent at the cellular level.
Accelerating the bad chemistry, basically.
And one more point they touched on, though, maybe more relevant to EAC, which didn't show the link as strongly here, is that drinking hot liquids might increase gastric reflux.
Oh, right. Stomach acid coming back up.
Yeah. So if hot liquids do that, you could potentially get a double whammy of heat damage and acid damage, though, again, this study linked heat more directly to ESCC risk.
Okay, those are several pretty convincing potential mechanisms.
Yeah.
But we should also talk about the study's limits, right? No study is perfect.
Absolutely crucial. And the authors were upfront about the limitations. A big one, as we touched on, is that all the studies included were observational, mostly case control.
Which means they looked back in time, asking people with cancer and without cancer about their past habits.
Right. And that design is prone to bias. Selection bias, where the cancer patients and control groups truly comparable. And information bias, especially recall bias.
Can people accurately remember years later exactly how hot they usually drank their tea? Especially if they now have a cancer diagnosis? Probably tricky.
Extremely tricky. That's a major weakness. Another huge one we already discussed is the definition of hot.
Right, no standard thermometer test, just people saying hot or very hot.
Exactly. Different studies use different terms, all subjective. It makes it really hard to compare accurately or figure out if there's a specific temperature threshold.
And that lack of precise temperature data meant they couldn't do a proper dose-response analysis, right? They couldn't say X degrees hotter means Y% more risk.
Correct. They could only compare broad categories like hot versus not hot. So we know there's a link, but the exact relationship between degrees of heat and level of risk isn't clear from this data.
Okay, so given those limitations, the study design issues, the subjective temperature problem, what did the researchers say we need next? What kind of future studies?
Their recommendations were clear. First, we need large prospective cohort studies.
Following healthy people forward in time.
Yes. Track a large group of people over many years, record their habits before anyone gets sick, and then see who develops cancer. That avoids recall bias. And critically,
let me guess, measure the actual temperature.
You got it. Future studies absolutely need objective measurements of the temperature of the beverages and foods as people actually consume them. That's the only way to get reliable dose-response information.
Makes total sense. Anything else?
Yes, they also stress the need for better control of confounding factors. Things like smoking, alcohol use, BMI, socioeconomic status. These are all linked to esophageal cancer, too. Future studies need to carefully measure and statistically adjust for these factors to really isolate the effect of temperature itself.
So better study design, objective temperature measurement, and better handling of other risk factors.
That's the roadmap they laid out. This meta-analysis was a huge step in pooling the evidence we had, but it also showed us exactly where we need to go next for more definitive answers.
Okay. So let's try to synthesize this for everyone listening. Taking this deep dive into the Chen study, what's the main takeaway for you and your habits?
I think the main message is pretty compelling, despite the limitations. This large-scale analysis found strong evidence that regularly drinking very hot beverages or eating very hot foods is linked to a significantly higher risk of esophageal cancer.
Especially that squamous cell type, ESCC.
Especially ESCC, yes. And the risk seems particularly elevated based on studies in Asian and South American populations. The data from Europe was less clear in this analysis.
So if you're someone who really likes your coffee, tea, soup, whatever, served piping hot, scalding hot, this research suggests you might want to reconsider that.
It really does. It suggests that the temperature itself is likely a risk factor, independent of what the actual food or drink is. It's about the heat causing damage over time.
And it's probably not about the occasional sip that's too hot, but the habit of always consuming things at very high temperatures.
Exactly. It's the chronic, repeated thermal injury over years and decades that seems to be the concern based on the mechanisms we discussed. So letting things cool down just a bit, to warm rather than scalding.
Seems like a simple, potentially impactful change you could make?
Based on this evidence, yes. It's a reminder that sometimes it's not just the chemistry of what we consume, but the physics of it too, like temperature, that can matter for our long-term health.
So recapping the deep dive, this 2015 meta-analysis pulled together data from dozens of studies and found a significant link, almost double the risk overall, between consuming hot food and drinks and esophageal cancer, mainly the ESCC type, with notable differences across regions.
That's a good summary. It provides pretty strong evidence for the association while also highlighting, very clearly, the need for more precise research, especially measuring actual temperatures.
It really does make you think, doesn't it, about all the small, repeated physical interactions our bodies endure. We focus on heat damaging the esophagus lining here, but it leads to a broader question. While if repeated thermal stress can add up over time, what about other subtle chronic physical things? Like, say, the friction from chewing really tough foods day after day, or maybe even slight persistent changes in the temperature of the air we breathe in different climates. Could these kinds of cumulative physical interactions also be influencing our tissues and health over decades in ways we haven't fully appreciated yet?
That's a really interesting thought. Expanding the idea of cumulative physical wear and tear beyond just obvious injuries or heat, considering the long-term sum of seemingly minor physical interactions. Definitely food for thought.
Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the surprising link between temperature and health.